The ground beneath their feet was not solid. It was a lie. In the dry, choking red dust of South Vietnam, in the provinces near Saigon, the war had a rhythm. The Americans owned the day. Their helicopters tore the sky. Their artillery shattered the horizon, and their patrols, heavy with firepower, pushed into the green maze. But the night belonged to an enemy they could not find. And even the day was filled with a terrible magic. A sniper's shot would crack from a patch of empty scrubland. A patrol would pursue and find nothing, not a footprint, not a broken branch. An entire enemy unit would engage a U.S. platoon, fight with bitter intensity, and then dissolve. They vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Soldiers, trained in the warfare of continents, of front lines and clear objectives, were fighting phantoms. They were fighting an army that lived in the air between the leaves, in the shadow of the grass. Until 1965, in the district of Cu Chi, a group of soldiers, frustrated, taking cover, noticed something impossible, a wisp of smoke rising from the flat, hard-packed ground. There was no fire. There was no hut. There was just smoke. They traced it to a termite mound, and the termite mound was hollow, and beneath it was a wooden trapdoor. When they lifted it, the humid air of the jungle was replaced by a different kind of breath. Cool, stale, the smell of damp clay, and something human, hidden. What they had found was not a hole. It was not a bunker. It was a doorway to a war beneath the war, an inverted subterranean world that defied every rule of military logic, a labyrinth of impossible engineering and suffocating patience. The Americans could not believe what was beneath their feet, because beneath their feet was the enemy's fortress, his home, his hospital, his highway, and his grave. This is the story of that world, and of the men who volunteered to go down. This is not a story of sweeping battles. It is a story of silence, of inches, of the courage it takes to face the dark with nothing but a pistol in your hand. The place was called the Iron Triangle, a 40-square-mile patch of jungle and rubber plantations just 20 miles northwest of Saigon. To the American command, it was a cancer, a staging ground, a supply depot, and a command center for the Viet Cong. From here, they launched rockets into the capital. From here, they controlled the infiltration routes. And from here, they disappeared. The problem was simple. You cannot destroy what you cannot find. In January 1966, the U.S. Army launched one of the largest operations of the war. Operation Crimp. 8,000 men, infantry, airborne, engineers. Backed by waves of B-52 bombers, the plan was to sweep the Iron Triangle clean, to find the enemy headquarters and destroy it, once and for all. The bombers came first. They laid down a carpet of high explosives that pulverized the jungle. The ground shook for miles. It seemed impossible that anything living could survive. Then the infantry moved in. They found very little: shattered trees, empty villages, a few scattered enemy troops who fought briefly and vanished. The great secret headquarters was nowhere. The operation was a frustration. The soldiers were walking on eggshells, finding booby traps and snipers, but no army. And then they started finding the doors, hidden under cooking fires, in the back of animal pens, beneath the floors of huts, beneath the roots of trees. Small wooden hatches, expertly camouflaged. The command was baffled. These were clearly hiding spots. They tried to destroy them. They dropped grenades down the holes. The explosions were muffled, swallowed by the earth. When the smoke cleared, the holes were still there. They tried pumping in tear gas. The soldiers waited. And somewhere, 50 yards away, a faint wisp of blue gas would rise from a termite mound. The gas had been rerouted. They realized, with a dawning, terrible sense of scale, that this was not a series of individual holes. It was a system. They were not standing on top of bunkers. They were standing on top of a city. The tunnels of Cu Chi, a network that would eventually stretch over 150 miles, dug not with machines but by hand, dug with hose and baskets, one shovelful of damp, red clay at a time. Dug over decades, starting in the 1940s against the French, and now expanded into a strategic weapon against the Americans. This was the masterpiece of the Viet Cong, a three-level complex. The first level, just 10 feet down, contained the fighting bunkers, the firing ports, and the booby traps. The second level, 15 feet deeper, held the hospitals, the weapon factories, the kitchens, and the sleeping quarters. The third, deepest level, was a safe haven, deep enough to withstand the crushing weight of bombs and tanks. This system was not just a tunnel. It was an ecosystem. It had air vents, disguised as termite hills. It had water wells, dug deep inside the network. It had kitchens with long, angled flues that dispersed cooking smoke into the dense jungle foliage, far from the source. It had operating theaters, where surgeons worked by lamplight. It had command centers, where officers planned the war, literally underneath the boots of the American bases built above them. The Americans had built a massive divisional headquarters right on top of the VC's regional headquarters. The enemy was listening to them, watching them, living beneath them. The military command faced a problem they had never encountered. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, in a fortress you cannot destroy from the outside? The conventional soldier was the wrong tool. A 6-foot American, broad-shouldered, loaded with 60 pounds of gear, a rifle, a pack, grenades, canteens, could not fit down those narrow, 3-foot-high openings. And even if he could, he was not trained for this. He was trained to shoot at a distance. In the tunnels, the distance was 0. The army needed a new kind of soldier, and so an unofficial volunteer force was born. They called themselves the Tunnel Rats. They were, by necessity, the smallest men in the unit. Wiry, thin, often of Hispanic or Italian descent, men who could move through the tight confines. But size was not the main qualification. The main qualification was a specific color of courage, a quiet, almost reckless bravery, mixed with an immense, patient calm. They were men who could control their fear. Men who, for some reason, were not broken by claustrophobia. Their mission was simple and insane. Go down alone, or in pairs. Go down into the absolute suffocating darkness, and map what you find. Capture prisoners if you can, and kill anything that moves. The kit of a tunnel rat was a rejection of modern warfare. They stripped off their helmets and flak jackets. They were too bulky. They left their M16 rifles behind. The long barrel was useless around a tight corner. They went down with the barest essentials: a .45 caliber pistol or a revolver, a knife, a flashlight, often held in the same hand as the pistol, the beam of light dancing with the muzzle, and a ball of string to tie near the entrance, so they might find their way back. Imagine the descent. You slide your legs into the hole. The air changes instantly. The 110-degree tropical heat vanishes. It becomes cool, damp, musty. You are breathing the air of the deep earth, mixed with the smell of unexploded ordnance, of human waste, of cooking charcoal, and of fear. You pull the trap door closed above you, and the light of the world is gone. There is no sound. There is only the drip of water, the scuttling of insects, and the roar of your own blood in your ears. You turn on the flashlight. The beam cuts a tiny yellow circle in a darkness so complete, it feels solid. It feels like it's pressing against your skin. You begin to crawl, on your hands and knees, sometimes on your belly. The tunnel is so narrow your shoulders scrape both sides. The air is thin, and you are breathing your own exhalations. Every sense is on fire. Your skin feels for the slightest change in texture. Your ears listen for the scrape of a boot, the click of a safety, the sound of breathing that is not your own. If you've ever felt the panic of a closing space, you know that sound. The sound of your own heart, so loud you fear the enemy can hear it. This was not combat. This was a hunt in the dark, where you were also the prey. The Viet Cong were masters of their domain. They had engineered this world not just for hiding, but for defense. The tunnels were a weapon system. They were filled with traps, designed with a terrifying, intimate knowledge of human psychology. The tunnel rat, crawling forward, would feel his hand brush a thin wire, a tripwire. To pull it or cut it, it might be connected to a grenade, or it might be a dud wire, a decoy, and the real trigger was a pressure plate under his knee, right where he paused. The Viet Cong understood the reflex to flinch. There were the punji stakes, sharpened bamboo slivers smeared with human filth to cause infection, hidden in a covered pit. The crawling soldier would put his hand or knee down, and the stake would pierce him. The instinctive reaction? To pull back. But the VC knew this, so they angled the stakes. When you pulled back, you only drove the poison spike deeper into your own flesh. There were trapdoors that opened downwards. The man in front would crawl over it safely. The man behind him would fall into a pit of spikes. There were snakes. The VC would sometimes tie venomous vipers, the two-step snake, they called it, because that's all you took before you died, to bamboo, and hang them from the ceiling at face level. The tunnel rat's light would catch the glint of scales, just as he was about to touch it. And then there was the enemy himself, the VC soldier, waiting in an alcove, with a knife. The tunnel rat's greatest fear was not the traps. It was the bend. The tunnel would turn sharply. You could not see what was around that corner. You had to push your light forward, then your gun, then your head, and pray that nothing was waiting for you. Sometimes there was a single blinding muzzle flash, a deafening explosion that ruptured eardrums in the tiny space. The concussion alone was a physical blow. It was a fight of seconds, of pure animal reflex. There was no time for tactics, no time for aiming. There was only the flash, the noise, and then silence. And one man would be left in the dark. The men who lived in these tunnels were just as courageous. They were often local villagers, men and women who farmed by day and fought by night. They endured conditions that were almost unimaginable. They lived in the damp and the dark for weeks, sometimes months at a time. They were ravaged by malaria, by dysentery, by parasites. They breathed air so poor that their lamps would barely stay lit. And they lived with the thunder. When the B-52s struck, the ground above them would heave. The tunnels would shake. Dirt would rain from the ceilings. The concussions were so violent, they could cause internal bleeding even deep underground. It was the feeling of being buried alive over and over again. This was their home. This was their war. And they defended it with an ingenuity that matched the Americans. When the tunnel rats began using dogs, German shepherds, hooch dogs, to sniff out the vents, the VC adapted. They began placing captured American soap or stolen packs of cigarettes at the air vents. The dogs, smelling the familiar American scent, would pass right by. When the Americans began pumping in tear gas, the VC built U-bends in the tunnels. These water traps, a U-shaped dip that filled with water, created an airtight seal. The gas could not pass. The VC soldier would simply dip his head under the water and emerge on the other side, breathing clean air. Comment the iron triangle. If you can imagine the sheer, unyielding will it took to build and defend this subterranean world, this was a war of ingenuity, a war of trap versus flashlight, of patience versus technology. For the tunnel rats, the psychological toll was immense. These men were often loners on the surface. Down below, they were a tribe. They developed a sixth sense. They said they could smell a trap. They could feel the air pressure change, telling them a VC soldier was nearby, breathing the same pocket of air. They learned to trust their instincts above all else. They would enter a tunnel, crawl 50 feet, and just stop. Something felt wrong. They would back out, inch by inch, and report it. The engineers would come in and blow the tunnel, and later they would find it had been massively Bo-Obi trapped just around the next bend. They became experts in the enemy's mind. They knew which tunnels were busy and which were abandoned. They found the hospitals, the the bodies of VC soldiers, the maps, the stores of rice. They were spectral, like the enemy. Crawling through the dark, they became a mirror of the men they were hunting. But this courage came at a cost that no one on the surface could understand. A tunnel rat would go down. He would spend 2, 3, sometimes 5 hours in the black, crawling, listening, fighting. And then he would emerge. He would push open the trapdoor and crawl back into the light. He would be covered in red clay, soaked in sweat, his hands shaking. His eyes, accustomed to the dark, would be blinded by the brutal Vietnam sun. He would stand up, and he would be a ghost among the living. The other soldiers, the grunts who walked the surface, looked at them with a mixture of awe and fear. They looked at them like men who had already died, like men who had been to a place from which no one could truly return. They would sit, smoking a cigarette, their 1,000-yard stare not looking at the horizon, but at the ground beneath their feet. They could never again trust the solid earth. They knew what was down there. They knew the darkness was not empty. It was waiting. In the end, the tunnels were not defeated by men. They were defeated by machines. The U.S. command realized they could not clear this labyrinth. The cost in lives was too high. The psychological price too steep. If you cannot clear it, you must destroy it. Operation Cedar Falls in 1967 was the final answer. This time the B-52s came, and they did not stop. Then, massive bulldozers, fitted with giant plows, they called them Roman plows, were brought in. They simply scraped the jungle away. They tore the surface of the earth off, down to the red clay. They exposed the tunnel entrances, and then the engineers went in, not with pistols, but with tons of explosives. They did not crawl. They dropped charges. They pumped acetylene gas into the system and ignited it. They collapsed the tunnels, one section at a time. They filled them with water. They buried them. They erased the subterranean fortress from the map, or so they thought. They had destroyed vast sections, but the system was too large, too deep, too complex. The Viet Cong simply retreated, waited, and dug again. A year later, during the Tet Offensive, the cleared tunnels of Cu Chi were the primary staging ground for the assault on Saigon. The fortress had endured. The war beneath the war had never really ended. Today, parts of the Cu Chi tunnels are a historical site. They have been widened, cemented, and lit so that tourists can walk through them. But these are not the real tunnels. The real tunnels remain, dark, narrow, and silent. They are a monument, not to a victory or a defeat, but to the human capacity to endure, the ingenuity to build a world from nothing but clay and patience, and the terrifying, quiet courage of those who fought within it. The legacy of the tunnel rats is not written in statues. It is written in the silence of those who returned. They came home, but they brought the tunnels with them. They carried the claustrophobia, the darkness, the memory of that stale air. They understood a truth that the rest of the world did not. They knew that the most terrifying battlefield is not the one filled with noise and fire. It is the one that is silent, the one that is pitch black, the one where the enemy is an inch from your face. The war in Vietnam was fought in the mountains, in the rice paddies, and in the cities. But the truest, darkest version of that war was fought inside the earth. It was a war of inches, a war of shadows, a war against the primal fear that lives in all of us. The men who went down, they faced an enemy, but they also faced themselves. If this story of courage in the dark, of the men who fought beneath the earth, moved you right below, we never forget. They went down into the dark so that others could stand in the light, and the ground, for them, would never be solid again.